Okay, good morning. Today we are very glad to have here in Girona another time Professor Fred Schauer. Fred Schauer is for sure so well-known legal professor that no need absolutely presentation and no needs presentation, and especially here in Girona. He was 3 or 4 times in Girona for making different seminars, and today is another time here in order to talk about statistical discrimination. This topic is not absolutely new in the Schauer's bibliography, and just I can remember closer related book some years ago, probabilities, stereotypes,
probabilities and stereotypes. Yeah.
And that is very, very close with a topic for today. It's a pleasure for us to have you another time here, and thank you so much. It's your time.
Thank you very much, Jordi. It is very good to be back. As you said, this is, I think, my 3rd or 4th seminar here, plus having participated in the big grand Congress in 2010, still a very memorable event, partly because it was in Girona, partly because it was intellectually fascinating, partly because it is inconceivable that in my country one could have 300 or 400 people in the audience for a Congress on legal philosophy. It would never happen. So I am happy to be here. I've been asked to talk about statistical discrimination. As Jordi said, it is a topic I have worked on before, but I have returned to it more recently. There are several forthcoming handbooks and encyclopedias coming out that I've been asked to write entries for, so I have been thinking and rethinking the topic, and I'm delighted to talk about it here and listen to what you have to say, your responses, questions, and so on. So I start as a matter of definition with the idea that, at least for me, discrimination as a word is a non-moralized idea. So one can have a moralized conception of discrimination such that when something is discriminatory, it is wrong by virtue of just how we use the word. My preference is to have a non-moralized conception of discrimination such that discrimination is merely the fact of drawing distinctions. And whether discriminating in this sense is good or bad, or when it is good or bad, is a separate question. So, as I said, I start with this idea of discrimination as non-moralized, as morally indiscriminate. So, for example, there are some forms of discrimination, simply drawing distinctions, some forms of discrimination that are generally thought of as good. It is a form of discrimination that I am not permitted to vote on the question of Catalan independence. It is similarly, it is a form of discrimination that you are not permitted to vote on whether Donald Trump can or cannot be president of the United States. Whether it is good that I cannot vote on Catalan independence and you cannot vote on Donald Trump would take us into a different area. But the very fact that who can vote and who cannot draws lines, makes distinctions, is a form of discrimination. Similarly, 12-year-olds are not permitted in most places to vote. They are not permitted in most places to drive. They are not permitted in most places to drink alcohol. To say that a 12-year-old cannot drink alcohol or drive or vote is once again a form of discrimination. But none of these are forms of discrimination that we would think of as bad. But they are still forms of discrimination. They are drawing lines. They put people into different categories. Other forms of discrimination we think are generally or always bad. In much of the United States until the 1960s, black people could not vote. In much of the world, by virtue of less official forms of discrimination, women are discouraged from being scientists or mathematicians. Again, these are forms of discrimination, but these are forms of discrimination that these days we tend to condemn. And then there are forms of discrimination that are more debatable. So it turns out, as some of the issues in the recent American election again have brought out, it turns out that unless you are born as a United States citizen, you cannot be president of the United States. This is not an American peculiarity. As I understand it, although I have not looked at the original laws, if you are not a native-born Mexican, you cannot be a judge in Mexico. So once again, and these are forms of discrimination that are not so clearly good as some of the earlier ones I mentioned, and not so clearly bad as the second category. They are more debatable. But all of these are forms of discrimination. So what then is statistical discrimination? So call statistical discrimination a subset or subcategory of discrimination. And now I have to draw still a further distinction. Some forms of discrimination are not instrumental. So, for example, in most places there are separate bathrooms for men and women. This is not instrumental. It's not based on the idea that there are certain things, certain characteristics that being male or being female is a proxy for. It is just the view that separation in itself is appropriate. Whether it's appropriate or not is something else again, but at least the view is it is the separation itself that is ultimately and non-instrumentally appropriate. Or, to take a somewhat more obvious example, women cannot be priests in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church does not take the position that it wants its priests to have certain characteristics, and maleness is a statistical indicator of those characteristics. Rather, it is just that separation by gender is itself ultimately and non-instrumentally appropriate. So we might call this let us call it in a way direct discrimination or non-instrumental discrimination or something of that variety. So put that aside. I am mostly interested here, for purposes of this project, in what we can call instrumental discrimination or proxy discrimination. That is, we have some goal, whether it be a governmental goal or a private goal. There is some goal, and certain forms of discrimination are thought to facilitate achieving a goal where the goal itself is not categorized in terms of a form of discrimination. So I'll give a few examples. Some of them are new, some of them are from what I wrote some years ago. So people over a certain age cannot be commercial airline pilots. The age has changed over the years. It varies a little bit from country to country, but it doesn't vary so much that I would not, there is no country in the world that would allow me at my current age to be a commercial airline pilot. I don't know how to fly a plane, but we'll put that aside. Even if I knew how to fly a plane, there is no country in the world that would allow me at my current age to allow me to be an airline pilot. Now, here, this discrimination is instrumental to something else. So it turns out that people believe, or licensing authorities believe, or airlines believe, that it is a good idea that pilots be able to see well at night. They think it is a good idea that pilots be able to hear well. And they think it is a good idea that pilots have fast reflexes. And they think it is a good idea that pilots all of a sudden will not drop dead or become incapacitated by having a stroke or a heart attack while piloting the airplane. So it turns out that being over a certain age, 60, for example, or most commonly, being over age 60 is a probabilistic or statistical indicator of having poor vision at night, especially under circumstances not only of low light but high glare, when there's distracting glare kinds of vision. Being over 60 is also a probabilistic statistical indicator of having poor hearing, especially poor hearing when there is background noise. So if you have ever, when flying a plane or being in a plane, listened to the pilot's conversations, like some airlines let you do, you discover immediately that not only is there a conversation between the pilot and the tower going on, but also at the same time there are lots of other conversations going on in the background, and you have to hear pretty well to be able to hear what you are supposed to be hearing against all of this background noise. Being good at that correlates with age. If you are younger than 60, you are likely to be better than that than if you are older than 60. It's also the case that being older than 60 correlates with slower reflexes. When something goes bad in the plane, you want the pilot to be able to react instantly. But quick reflexes, again, correlate with age. And most interestingly, it turns out that having a stroke or a heart attack correlates with age, even if there are no indicators from blood pressure or anything else. So it turns out, for example, I have no idea what any of your blood pressures are. I'm on safe ground by saying I don't know what your blood pressures are. I don't know what your cholesterol count is in your blood. Nevertheless, what medical science tells us is that despite the fact that I have low blood pressure and low cholesterol and everything else, I am more likely to drop dead right now from a stroke or a heart attack than any of you. even though there are no indications whatsoever. Whether it be the likelihood of stroke or reflexes or vision or hearing, age is a statistical indicator, a statistical proxy of something that the airlines and the airlines authority think is a good thing, and therefore the discrimination is an indicator. No question here of causation, or not necessarily of causation, but it is nevertheless a statistical indicator of something we think desirable for non-discriminatory reasons. There is no discrimination inherent in airlines believing that it's good if their pilots don't have strokes while they are piloting the plane. Nevertheless, this non-discriminatory, let us call it neutral, although we can put scare quotes around neutral, this neutral goal is something that is facilitated by drawing a distinction by discriminating on the basis of age. A legitimate, neutral, non-discriminatory goal, but discrimination is statistically or probabilistically conducive of that. There are a number of other examples of the same kind of phenomenon. One that I have talked about on a little bit in the book that you read the preface to, a little bit on various other occasions. There are restrictions in a number of countries on certain breeds of dogs, most commonly pit bulls, technically American Staffordshire Terriers, but generically pit bulls. People think, in general, that it is good to restrict dogs that are dangerous and aggressive. It turns out that pit bulls are more likely to be dangerous and aggressive than other kinds of dogs, and therefore pit bullness, if we can call it that, pit bullness is a probabilistic or statistical indicator of dangerous aggressiveness, even though it is far from perfect. Similarly, one of the things, to go back to the example of airlines, one of the things that airlines would like to have is people who are handling baggage, who are good at being able to lift heavy suitcases quickly and put them on the airplane. That's a totally neutral goal. We might imagine, and I'll come back to the example, we might imagine an airline saying, we only want men for the job as baggage handlers because as a probabilistic statistical matter, women are less likely to be able to handle heavy suitcases than men. Now, as I said, I'll return to the example, but it is an example of a form of discrimination, a form of classification that is probabilistically indicative of some neutral or non-discriminatory goal. In recent years, this has become a topic of considerable interest to philosophers of language. Perhaps most prominently in this area is a Princeton philosopher named Sarah Jane Leslie, L-E-S-L-I-E. Sarah Jane Leslie is a philosopher of language at Princeton who has devoted much of her career to the analysis of generics. Generics relate closely to what I have just been talking about. A generic is a statement about a class or a statement about a category, and a statement about a class or a category that can tolerate counterexamples, that can tolerate exceptions. So, for example, one of the examples that Leslie uses is the statement, mosquitoes carry malaria. Most of us would think that's a correct statement. But it is a correct statement despite the fact that most mosquitoes do not carry malaria. But when we say mosquitoes carry malaria, what we are saying is that mosquitoes carry malaria more than other insects, more than other creatures, and that the statement mosquitoes carry malaria is a statement that we understand to be correct, despite the fact that there are counterexamples, despite the fact that there are lots of mosquitoes that do not carry malaria. Or, to use an example that I have used in the past, including in this book before I even knew of the word generics, Volvos are reliable.
Not
There are
Volkswagen.
non-Volvo...
Volvo, not Volkswagen.
Well, not Volvo. Well, the question of whether Volkswagens are reliable is, to use a somewhat technical term, orthogonal to the question of whether the Volkswagen company cheats in terms of emissions. But if I say Volvos are reliable, and you say, well, I had a Volvo 15 years ago that was not reliable, I might say, so what? It is still the case that the class statement, the category statement, Volvos are reliable, is understood to be correct. Now, what does it mean to say that a class statement or a category statement is correct? Obviously, it is not to say that every example is true. It is not to say mosquitoes carry malaria is not to say that every mosquito carries malaria. To say that pit bulls are dangerous is not to say that every pit bull is dangerous. To say that Volvos are reliable is not to say that every Volvo is reliable, and so on. Indeed, it is not even to say that the majority of Volvos are reliable or the majority of mosquitoes carry malaria. It is only to say that a certain trait that we are interested in, malaria carrying, dangerous aggressiveness about dogs, is more present for this class. The attribute is more present for this class than it is for some background class to which we are comparing this one. So I'll give a concrete example. I'll come back to pit bulls again. It is almost certainly the case that no more than, let us say, and this is an approximation, let us say no more than 10% of pit bulls are dangerously aggressive. But it is also the case, so again, I will make up a number, but it's reasonably close. Let's say that no more than 5% of dogs in general are dangerously aggressive. So to say that pit bulls as a class are dangerously aggressive is to say that dangerous aggressiveness is more present in the class of pit bulls than it is in the class of dogs in general, even though it is present for less than a majority, far less than a majority of pit bulls. And what Leslie and others work on are all of these kinds of variations on the basic claim that it is part of our conceptual analysis, conceptual apparatus, part of our language, that we use these class statements all the time. And indeed, not only do we use these class statements all the time as a matter of language, people who don't understand this are, to use another technical term, annoying. We all know these kinds of annoying people. So suppose I make the statement to you, Swiss cheese has holes. And you say to me, but I had a piece of Swiss cheese yesterday and it did not have holes in it. I could respond by saying, well, I was just making a probabilistic statement, or I could respond by saying, don't be annoying. That is, there is it is hard to imagine that we could talk, that we could think, without being able to make statements about the tendencies or attributes of classes that may not be, where the attribute may not be present in every member of the class. So let's call them class statements. Now, some class statements, some probabilistic attributions, some statistical attributions are genuinely spurious. That is, they are simply false. So, for example, in the 19th century, in much of at least North America and Europe, there were lots of people who believed in the science of phrenology. Phrenology, phrenology. The science of phrenology says that you can determine someone's personality or personal attributes or traits by the terrain of their head, the outside of their head, not the inside. That is, if you have bumps in certain places, you are more likely to be intelligent. If your head is shaped this way rather than that way, you are more likely to have a quick temper. And you may have seen at some point the heads, usually made out of white ceramic, that phrenologists would use so to identify the particular fields or particular areas that represented different parts of the human personality. This was all the rage in the 19th century. There were doctors of phrenology. You could go to a school and get a degree in phrenology. You could. There were associations of phrenologists. There were journals of phrenology. It had all of the external trappings of science. There was only one problem, and here I'll use another technical term. It was all crap. That is, it had no statistical basis whatsoever. Let me, given the presence, I assume that there are a number of you, by virtue of you being here and why you are here, that Jordi and Michaela are not the only people in the room who are interested in the law of evidence and proof, correct? Okay. Mm-hmm. So phrenology turns out to be a very common example in the U.S. of the old test for expert evidence. So the old test for expert evidence that came out of a 1923 American case called Frey versus the United States, the Frey test for the validity of expert testimony or expert evidence was only whether a particular method was accepted in the discipline within which the expert purported to operate. Phrenology is a good example of something that had an enormous amount of internal validity but no external validity. That is, there was a field, phrenology. It had the associations, the degrees, the journals, and everything else, and therefore certain phrenological methods could have been fully accepted within phrenology and therefore would have been accepted under the Frey test even though they had no external validity whatsoever. So phrenology is a good historical example. Now I fear that I am about to insult somebody, but that's okay. Much the same applies now with astrology. That is, There are people now who believe that being a Sagittarius or a Capricorn or a Virgo or a Libra is probabilistically indicative of certain personality characteristics. Oh, you're a Sagittarius, so that means you must be a such and such, or it makes you more likely to be a such and such, and so on and so on. Widely believed now, nevertheless, it is subject to the same characterization that phrenology would have been in the 19th century. That is, there is no evidence whatsoever that the month in which you were born is probabilistically indicative of anything, even if we accept the legitimacy of the anything to which it is probabilistically indicative of. There's one cute little footnote to the example that I just mentioned. It turns out that in a couple of narrow little domains, the month in which you were born makes a difference. So the most prominently discussed of these is Canadian junior hockey. So if you are a Canadian hockey player at age 7 or 8 or 9, you are allowed to start playing a certain kind of organized junior hockey. It turns out that when you are allowed to start depends on how old you are on a certain date. So therefore, the difference between people born in November and people born in January might turn out to be an entire year's difference in whether you can start junior hockey this year or you have to wait for another year to start junior hockey. If you get to start earlier, then you have more experience than others, and this carries through to some number of different levels of hockey. And because the month you were born correlates or is represented or could be represented by an astrological sign, you could say that being a Sagittarius or a Capricorn or a Libra is statistically indicative of success in Canadian junior hockey. Apart from that, again, we can say that it is spurious. Some of these spurious examples are more pernicious than the ones that I have just described. The widespread, even still, view that gay men lack physical courage has no statistical basis whatsoever, but widely believed. That sexual orientation is a statistical indicator of physical courage or physical bravery. Once again, totally spurious. So, when we talk about statistical discrimination, then, what we are thinking about, or what I am most interested in, is within this category of instrumental forms of discrimination, within the category of statistically justified statistical forms of discrimination, not the spurious ones, the statistically justified ones, whether it be for pit bulls or women as baggage handlers or younger people as pilots. How are we to think about which statistically justified forms of instrumental discrimination are justified and which are not? That's the big question. Now, there is one view that would say that all forms of discrimination that are statistically justified are legitimate. Lots of people believe that. They are wrong to believe that, in my view. We can think of some number of examples of statistically justified discrimination that we would nevertheless think of as socially, politically, and morally unacceptable. we would think it socially, politically, or at least I won't speak for you, I would think it socially, politically, and morally unjustifiable, impermissible, if an orchestra were to say, okay, we are looking for new violinists. The only people who are allowed to audition to be violinists are those whose background is Asian. Probably statistically justifiable, these days morally unacceptable. If some high school or equivalent basketball team says the only people that we want on the basketball team are people with African backgrounds, statistically justifiable, morally, politically, and socially unjustifiable. Or, and an example to which I will return, Apple, and I will use Apple just as an example of a computer company. I am not suggesting that Apple would actually do this. Apple is looking for new computer programmers. No women need apply. These days, early 2016, probably statistically justifiable, morally, socially, politically impermissible for reasons I'll get back to in a few minutes. But the view that statistical justification is a sufficient condition for permissible discrimination strikes me and most people, if we think about examples like this, as unacceptable. At the opposite extreme is the view that no form of statistical discrimination is justifiable, that in every conceivable domain we ought to look only at the individual and not at the generalization, not at the statistical categorization, and so on. Again, it is hard to imagine how we could think and how we could operate the world if on every occasion we looked at every individual totally as an individual. So we know, for example, that if you are 13 years old, you cannot drive a car in most countries. We would not think, or I would not think it plausible if the automobile licensing authorities were to say, we don't care how old you are. Everybody who wants a driver's license has the opportunity to come in and demonstrate whether they will be a good driver or not a good driver. And if you can demonstrate that you are a good driver, we will give you a driver's license, and we will not use age as a proxy or a surrogate for driving ability or driving responsibility. So too with drinking, so too with voting, so too with prohibitions on those who have been convicted of certain kinds of crimes, insofar as they are prohibited from engaging in certain occupations thereafter. Again, some might say, in every instance, all of these decisions should be made on an individual basis. And one of the reasons that I like to use minimum ages rather than maximum ages is that very few people would argue against the justifiability of the statistical discrimination that is present whenever we use a minimum age for drinking or driving or voting or things of this variety. So just as the view that all forms of discrimination that are statistically justified are permissible seems unacceptable, so too is the view that no form of statistical discrimination is justified, acceptable. So if we reject those two extremes, if we reject the extreme of all that are statistically justified are permissible, and if we reject the extreme of none are permissible, now things get somewhat more difficult. And I don't have any quick answers. I don't even have any not so quick answers, but I want to suggest 5 different considerations that we tend to think about and maybe that we ought to think about in evaluating which forms of statistically justified discrimination are permissible and which are not. One of them, and this is particularly present in the example I gave before about women and computer programmers and the like, is that it may be, and it is often the case, that what exists at a particular time as statistically justifiable discrimination is a product of previous non-statistically justifiable discrimination. So if at some time in the past the view was that it is appropriate for men to be physicians and lawyers, and for women to be nurses and librarians, and if for generations upon generations men are steered into being physicians and lawyers and women are steered into being librarians and nurses, then it would not surprise us that at some later time there would be a gender differential array in terms of particular qualifications. If it turns out that for hundreds of years women are told, to give a similar example, that the world of economics and finance is for men and not for women, that men should be investment bankers and financiers and women should be social workers, then we should not be surprised that at a given moment in time, women might have less in the aggregate financial talent, financial experience than men. A form of statistically justified discrimination that is the current offshoot of a previous practice of non-statistically justified discrimination. So it's one of the things that we would want to ask about when we are trying to evaluate the permissibility or non-permissibility of a form of discrimination. Similarly, and actually my numbers are wrong here, so what I just said about mathematical ability doesn't apply to me. Number 2 in my list of 6, it might be that the particular form of attribute that is selected as a pretense. That is, it might be that somebody thinks that it is a good idea to engage in discrimination on a certain basis, and they then select the attribute that they are looking for because the attribute that they are looking for would allow them to engage in discrimination, but what they are interested in is not the attribute, but what they are interested in is the discrimination. So this was at the center of a prominent American Supreme Court decision about all of this, going back about 15 years. So it was previously the case that an institution called the Virginia Military Institute was restricted only to men. And when it was challenged as violating the prohibitions on sex discrimination, now part of American constitutional doctrine. And the Virginia Military Institute, VMI, defended its practice by saying, we have a particular form of education here that men are more likely to adapt to than women. Who here has been in the military? Okay, so at least two of us in the room have been in the military. So it turns out that if you are in the military, especially if you are, let us say, at the lower ranks, if you are basic training, if you are in the military, involves people of more senior rank screaming and yelling at you. The primary method of indoctrination, the primary method of training, if you are a private, is that some sergeant screams and yells at you constantly, and that this makes you a better soldier. Put aside the issue of whether it actually does make you a better soldier or not, but VMI had an educational method that involved similarly lots of screaming and yelling at students by more senior students or by faculty, and that the Virginia Military Institute was of the belief that this made better students and better soldiers because it was training people to be military officers as well as students. It turns out that the historical record was pretty clear, that what the Virginia Military Institute was really interested in was having men and only men, and they picked this form of education as a way of having only men rather than having only men as a way of facilitating this form of education. So number two is what I want to call the pretense. That statistically valid discrimination might be a pretense for wanting to engage in discrimination in its own right for its own sake. Number three, it may be that certain forms of statistically justified discrimination are likely to be overused. So one good reason for prohibiting their use would be to mandate their underuse in order to prevent their overuse. So let me give an example. So I asked a moment ago if anybody here had ever been in the military. I'm going to ask another question, and none of you are going to say that you. Have any of you ever been a drug courier? So I assume that nobody in the room is willing to admit to being a drug courier, which is agnostic on the question whether anybody in the room actually was a drug courier or not. So it turns out that there are a number, let us assume, and there's probably some indication of this at the moment, there are a number of attributes that are probabilistically indicative at the moment of who is a drug courier and who is not. One of them is race, probably as a function of economic deprivation, but one of them is race. But there are a bunch of others as well. If you pay cash for your airline ticket, you are more likely to be a drug courier than if you use a credit card. If you are not a member of a frequent flyer program, you are more likely to be a drug courier than if you are a member of a frequent flyer program. If you wear sunglasses, you are more likely to be a drug courier than not. It turns out that drug couriers believe, whether correctly or not, that the inspectors at airports can tell whether you are telling the truth or not by looking at your eyes. So if you're worried about lying and being caught at lying, you wear sunglasses. And similarly, drug couriers, for somewhat more obvious reasons, are likely to wear loose clothing so that there are not big bulges in potentially revealing parts of their body. So let's say that I am correct, that among the attributes of being a drug courier is race, paying cash, not being a member of the frequent flyer program, wearing sunglasses, and having loose clothing. It turns out that because of people's own prejudices, they are likely among all of these to vastly overestimate the contribution of race to this multi-factor profile, rather than all of the others. And if race is likely to be dramatically overused beyond its statistical contribution, even if it has some statistical contribution, we might want to mandate its underuse to prevent its overuse. Closely related to this is the problem of certain traits, even statistically indicative ones, are more visible than others. So there were some number of incidents shortly after 9/11/2001 in which pilots and flight attendants would get onto an airplane. They would look out and see who the passengers were on the plane. And at least shortly after 9/11, there were some number of pilots and flight attendants who would refuse to fly on a plane in which there were Muslim passengers, who would have been obvious either by how they dressed or by the fact that their name on the passenger manifest would have been something like Muhammad rather than something like, say, Fred. It turns out that having a name like Muhammad or dressing in a certain way is very visible, but it may be more visible than other things that might be more indicative of the likelihood that there would be a problem. Suppose that you are a flight attendant, you get onto an airplane, you see that sitting in seat 23C is Muhammad, somebody, dressed and in appearance looking like Muhammad is somebody from the Middle East. Sitting next to Muhammad from the Middle East is John Smith, who has just been released from prison after having been twice convicted and imprisoned for planting bombs in government buildings. Who's more dangerous? I hope we want to say that John, who has just been released for prison, is more dangerous. Who's more obvious? Muhammad is more obvious, and therefore the obvious trait, even if it is at a low level somewhat statistically indicative, may once again lead it to be used far more than its statistical indication might indicate. Two other factors to be considered in all of this. What is the cost of individuation? That is, one of the things that the pilots have argued, the airline pilots have argued against the maximum age restriction, is there are not that many pilots in the world. You don't have to use a proxy. You don't have to use a statistical surrogate. You can simply test every pilot for vision, for reflexes, for hearing. The risk of having a sudden stroke makes this more complicated, but at least in terms of vision and reflexes and hearing, you can individuate. You can test everyone. You may not need a proxy. In some areas, this is a plausible thing to do. Similarly, if the Vienna Philharmonic is looking for a new first violinist, there aren't that many people who would be close to being on the short list For first violinist in the Vienna Philharmonic, you can audition everyone who would be close without having to say we are only interested in interviewing people with Asian backgrounds, or perhaps to be slightly more accurate, only interested in interviewing men, which was a problem in the Vienna Philharmonic until very recently. But the smaller the number, the more easy it may be to individuate. Not the same for other forms of discrimination. The Automobile Licensing Authority of Catalonia cannot give everybody from the age of 10 on up a driving test to see how good a driver they are. They have to use a proxy and say, what's the minimum driving age here? 17, 18? 18. They cannot say, okay, we'll interview and give a driving test to everyone. And similarly in a large number of other areas, including university admissions that use tests and so on, it may be implausible to individuate. And finally, and I'll end with this, an important consideration is every time that we understand that we are using a non-universal but statistically legitimate or statistically justifiable or mathematically justifiable proxy, we understand that we are going to commit a large number of errors. And then the question is, who bears the cost of error? This is a big issue and should be a big issue when we think about the practices of airlines or customs officials in determining who will be looked at more closely and who will not, who will be kept off planes and who will not, who will be on no-fly lists and who will not, and so on. So if it turns out that even if Middle Eastern origin is statistically non-spurious about a certain kind of airline violence or airline terrorism, it is still the case that 99 point whatever percent of people with that background are totally innocent. And therefore, to use this as a proxy imposes upon that group, the innocent people who have the attribute, imposes on that group the cost of the discrimination, even if the discrimination is justifiable. And once again, who is paying the cost of this may be relevant in which forms are justifiable and which forms are not. After all, many of the forms of discrimination that the airlines use, or the airline inspectors use, are used in large part because it would be costly to interrogate everybody more closely. So one of the reasons that the airlines are more willing to look more closely at people of Middle Eastern backgrounds when they engage in baggage or inspections is because they realize, unfortunately, that the rest of us are not willing to get to the airport an hour earlier. If we were all willing to get to the airport an hour earlier, it would be less necessary to use the proxy. I don't have any strong views about the array of all 6 of the ones that I've mentioned or other ones that might come in. All I've tried to suggest is that it is a mistake to assume that statistical justification is permissible just because it is statistically valid, but it's also a mistake to assume that we can navigate the world without ever engaging in some forms of statistical discrimination. And with that, I will stop.
Thank you so much.